It's great to be returning to the scene of many crimes. I have occupied at least 3 buildings in this campus at various times, but not this one. This building, my role was to break a blockade that football players were trying to put around the building, and it was a group of high school students from the neighborhood and radical athletes who did that, which says something about the Columbia football team, but also something that I want to leave you with before I introduce the panels. There would have been no Columbia strike success without the Harlem community and the high school students of this neighborhood. In the first 2 days of the strike, there were at least 400 athletes, massed outside the building, threatening to pull people out. And high school students from Harlem and Brandeis High School marched up in 500 strong, and that was the end of those athletes having anything to do with breaking the strike. So let's remember that part of this strike that hasn't been written in the history. I was there out on the street with those young people. This is an amazing panel, so I will leave it to our panelists to talk about our future. Our first panelist is Horace Campbell, who's professor of African American Studies and Political Science at Syracuse University. He is the author of Rasta and Resistance, From Marcus Garvey to Walter Rodney, Reclaiming Zimbabwe, the Exhaustion of a Patriarchal Motto of Liberation, and Pan-Africanism, Pan-Africanist, and African Liberation in the 21st Century. His most recent book is Barack Obama and 20th Century Politics, A Revolutionary Moment in the USA. Professor Horace Campbell.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How you doing?
Real close.
Okay, let me try one more time. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good. I want to thank all of you for coming out and for you to have the stamina to stay with us and to continue this discussion about a new vision of Black freedom, the Manning Marable Memorial Conference. I am pleased, and I want to thank Robin for reaching out to me as early as last year, May, as soon as Brother Manning joined the Ancestors. She was, along with all the friends and family, trying to rally forces to come together to see how can we carry forward the discussions and the tasks of building the legacy. And so our panel is on a new vision of Black freedom, reinvigorating social theory, redefining political struggle. So I want to say, how is it the Pan-African movement is inserted in this period of redefining political struggle? When the international media started broadcasting video footage of the Tunisian gathering in the streets in front of the central office, and they were chanting, "The people want to bring down the regime," something had changed in the world. And within a week, we saw that that change was even more profound in the streets of Tahrir Square in Egypt, when the Egyptian peoples organized to remove the Mubarak regime. Now, Peter Hallward says that the Egyptian revolution will change the world. And I want to agree with them, and I would like to locate what happened in Egypt within the confluence of the Pan-African and Pan-Arab revolutionary change, and to see how these changes will affect us, where we live, where we work, if we seek to understand what did they do in Egypt, how did they do it, what does it mean for us, and how will this process that is still unfolding affect us, those of us who live in the United States of America, and in a society that has vested interest in revolution. And I think the 99% movement is a direct influence that came out of the Egyptian struggle. And so our stake is with the revolutionary process in Egypt. And the Egyptians has helped to define the language in the Occupy movement to say there is a 1%. And that 1% has a stake in Egypt also, but that stake is in counter-revolution. So that my presentation is on the confluence between revolution and counter-revolution. And where is it that we, in our work, in terms of what we do, how we fit in between revolution and counter-revolution. The media, that is part of the military information operations of the state, want to take Egypt out of Africa. And so the nomenclature of what has happened in Egypt has nothing to do with Africa. They call it the Arab Spring. And this Arab Spring is to tell us that Egypt is not part of Africa, as they have done since the beginning of time, because the transformation of humanity came out of the peoples of the Nile Valley and the Nile Valley civilizations. But we in the Pambazuka movement, we produce a book called The African Awakening, Emerging Revolutions, and we have some copies of this book in the back there, where this book has shown that what happened in Egypt was not unique in Africa. It is part of an ongoing process that is going on in all parts of Africa, whether it's in the Sahara, whether it's in Chad, in the Comoros, in Zambia, in Senegal, in Burkina Faso, all over Africa. And we've seen the evidence of that confluence of revolution and counter-revolution. We've seen what happened in Libya. And I think we in the United States must be very clear about the meaning of the execution of Gaddafi for the counter-revolutionary forces in the world. And we cannot be silent on the fact that NATO and NATO forces continue to seek to dislodge and dispossess the people of North Africa from their resources and their wealth. Only last week, the British came out with a very grand statement that the Nubian aquifer has 99,000 square kilometers of underground water, which is what the Libyan people knew, which is what the people of Libya were mining in terms of building the great man-made river. And so not only did they occupy Libya, take over Libya, but they have seized $150 billion of the wealth of the Libyan people. And what are we saying about this in the left and progressive movement at this particular moment? Why are we silent? Why is it that we have bought into the media's understanding? I think we have to have the kind of sophistication that was developed by leaders such as Julius Nyerere. So although Nyerere was against Idi Amin, if Western imperialism came to fight against Idi Amin, he says it's Africans who had to take care of this problem. That kind of sophistication in terms of African liberation concepts is no longer present. You're either pro-imperialist or anti-imperialist. And that is that kind of simplicity we see in the Pan-African movement today in the discussion about Zimbabwe, about Uganda, and other parts of the Pan-African world, where this created such a cleavage in the Pan-African movement about what's happening in Africa and what is potentially the main force for revolution. But our panel is supposed to be on the new vision of freedom. And how do we have a vision if we do not grasp what are the leading edge of changes in the world today? Now, we are told that Craig Venter said that he has discovered synthetic life. Craig Venter was one of those who was involved in the Human Genome Project. And I think as human beings, Pan-Africanists, we have to pay attention to what Craig Venter or Ray Kurzweil is saying. Ray Kurzweil is talking about the future singularity. That is that moment when we have reached the point where we can merge the nanotechnology and biotechnology and robotics to create transhumans. What will be the meaning of transhumans in the 21st century? We are only 12 years in the 21st century, And they already talk about that time when we are going to create these superhuman beings. Who will decide and who will have control over these transhumans? And that is why we have to go back to the whole discussion of Pan-Africanism, because Pan-Africanism started out with a fundamental question about human dignity and who is a human being. Because the transatlantic slave trade had dehumanized Africans, Africans had asserted a higher conception of humanity than the European ideation system that believed in hierarchy, separation, and compartmentalization. And it was the Pan-African ideas of freedom, of trying to elaborate the humanity of the enslaved, that we have to go back to challenge the ideas of singularity, robotics, and genetic engineering that want to turn us into non-human beings in the 21st century. So these are the challenges, so that when the question is raised, is a new world possible? We are already in that new world. The question is, where are we going to fit in that new world? Who will have control over those resources in the new world, and what will be the nature of the organization of society in that new world? And so I think that the old questions of dignity are now joined with the new questions of how do we organize societies in the 21st century. Sam Merriman, who himself hails from Egypt, said quite clearly, we have to be audacious. It's called for audacity and more audacity. Audacity for what? Audacity to be able to conceive of a new form of society where we socialize the means of production, we dispossess the monopolies, and we give democratic rights to the majority of the peoples of the world so that we can create a new form of society. This idea of audacity in the 21st century must come before us because the old conceptions of Pan-Africanism, either of the liberal type, that we must create capitalists as in Kenya, or of the type of nationalizing the state capital as we had in other parts of Africa, they have exhausted themselves. And we've seen that the 19th century conceptions of socialism have brought humanity to a standstill, as we've seen in China, where the Chinese have been so successful in the development of the productive forces that they've destroyed the environment to the point that 500 million Chinese do not have clean running water. So how do we conceive of a new form of society, new form of organizing, where we bring new ideas about how to organize and to reconceptualize society? It makes no sense to say, well, in Zimbabwe, we want to take the land of the white peasants, the white farmers, to give it to big, rich farmers. We have to conceive of a different form of property relations. And this is what Sam Merriman is talking about. What kind of property relations will be developed in the 21st century for us to be human beings? And so, when we look at the convergence of the new technologies, along with the militarization of space, the militarization of the planet, there's a special responsibility for citizens of the United States of America. Because whether we like it or not, or whether they say it or not, we're in the midst of the deepest capitalist crisis since the 1930s. And the nature of the capitalist crisis, as we knew from 1930, is that the capitalists feel that there's only one way to resolve the crisis, and that is to go to war. And what would be the kind of war that we would have in the 21st century? We are already hearing the drum beats of war, where Israel and the right-wing sections of the United States of America are already at war against the people of Iran. As the Israeli ambassador to India said, people are thinking of war in the old ways, but they are fighting wars in the new ways. They are fighting cyber warfare, special forces, and they're already inside of Iran. And this will bring the whole world into a catastrophe, because this war against Iran will cascade into a wider war. So it is the task of the peace movement that they cannot be silent in the remilitarization of the planet. And what they're trying to do in this process of remilitarization is to mobilize our youth. How do they mobilize our youth? Well, they mobilize our youth because so many people do not want to talk about Africa. And so if someone comes up and says, I want a movement to help free people in Africa, and I'm calling ourselves invisible children to go out and to help someone called Coney 2012 and to capture Coney, then we'll get 100 million young people to sign on to bring US imperialism into Africa. It's a statement of the kind of work that we have to do, that when the military mobilizes 100 million young people under something that was false, that was a lie, that says that we in the progressive movement, we have to do so much more work. Coney 2012 was part of the disinformation campaign of the US military because Jason Russell, one of the articulators of that concept, was trained in the Institute of Creative Technologies that was set up by the Pentagon at the University of Southern California. And he was trained in brainwashing techniques. So this is a task that we have to deal with in the 21st century. How do we fight against the new skills that they're developing for the remilitarization of the planet Earth? So the old questions of Pan-African dignity are joined to the new questions of finding our humanity in the 21st century. And some of the old questions have not gone away. The idea of Pan-Africanism was based not only on dignity, but is based on the freedom and independence of all peoples in all parts of the world. Why is it the question of colonialism is no longer on the agenda? We have colonialism in North Africa. From the western part of North Africa, we have the Western Sahara where there's colonialism. In the eastern part of North Africa, we have the Palestinians that are under occupation. And the Pan-African movement have always been speaking about the rights of people who are under colonial rule, whether in Palestine or Western Sahara. Why are we silent on the question of colonialism in Puerto Rico? In the 1930s, the independence movement in Puerto Rico was the biggest movement in Puerto Rico. But they demonized the Puerto Rican independence movement, marginalized, put them in jail, and now they act as if independence is not part of the question in Puerto Rico. The Pan-African movement is not ceased to talk about the question of Puerto Rico. And what about the question of Haiti? Where this man, Mr. Clinton, who wants to be the outside president of Haiti, has built up this institutional organization called non-governmental organizations to take over Haiti. And every time you see young people, they all want to become humanitarian in the third world, which is the modern form of imperialism. Why is it that we are not raising the question of Haiti today? Because the question of Haiti is as urgent today as it was yesterday, because the people of Haiti are being punished for the idea of wanting freedom. And that punishment, they try to instill it in so many different ways. I'm told I have 2 minutes left. Yeah. But the Pan-African world is so big. It includes everybody because all of us are of African ancestry. But we cannot end without speaking about the changes in the world economy. They talk about emerging markets and emerging economies. What they do not say is that the fastest growing continent in the world is in Africa. 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. There was a time when the Economist magazine would talk about Africa, the hopeless continent. Last year, they came out with something called "The Sun Shines Brightly in Africa," which is more like a pun. And they pointed to the 6 fastest growing economies in Africa. If you look at what happened in China, at over 30 years, the Chinese economy was the fastest growing economy for 30 years, and by 2012, it surpassed the United States of America. You put that trajectory for the fastest growing economies in Africa for the next 20 years, what's it going to mean to the world? They understand that, and they fear that. Africa not only has a demographic power, it has huge resources, it has the most recent history of revolution, not only the revolutions in South Africa and the counter-revolution, but now the revolution in Egypt. And because of these attributes of Africa, U.S. imperialism has created the U.S. Africa Command. And the U.S. Africa Command is to get African Americans and African peoples and oppressed people in the United States to see that they should go to fight to save Africa. To save Africa from what? So we must oppose the U.S. Africa Command because we see the militarization of Africa and the militarization of the Pan-African world goes down to the lowest level in the community. And that is in every part of the Pan-African world, whether it is in Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, or in the streets of Brazil, the devaluation of the lives of poor and working class people, and especially poor people of color. So there are Trayvon Martins in all parts of the world. So it is calling on us to remobilize. We're not talking about emerging economies, just economies based on the development of economies. We're talking about the development of the capabilities, the skills, and the knowledge of the people. In every part of the world, whether it's Brazil, it's Nigeria, the people are fighting back. I just want to end with this story from Kenya, where CNN came out with a story that was saying that the Kenyan society was on fire. And the young people in Kenya developed what they call Twitter and some hash and said, CNN, you have it wrong. The White House in Kenya is going, the people are killing each other. In other words, they were saying to CNN that you're actually telling lies about what's going on in Kenya, that they were fighting back. And this is what's happening in Africa. The African people are fighting back against counter-revolution. And in this fight back against counter-revolution, they're fighting for a new mode of existence. And they're fighting against the kind of spiritual death that Ray Kurzweil and Craig Venter is promising us.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Barbara Ransby, a great historian, activist, who is the author of the award-winning biography of civil rights activist Ella Baker entitled Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement, A Radical Democratic Vision. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Everyone's told their low library stories, so I feel it's interesting to be inside. Tim McCarthy told the story of taking over Low Library in the 90s, but I was actually outside pregnant in the winter with a bullhorn and they wouldn't let us in. So that's my recollection of Low Library. I think this might have been one of the few times I've been inside. But I want to commend the organizers of this event really for doing an amazing job, for organizing some of the busiest people around to be in the same place for the same few days, to spread it out over 4 days and multiple venues so it's not just on campus. If I'm ever in jail or in trouble and we need a committee, I want them to be heading it up because they know how to get things done. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work in the academy. And I don't often do that because I'm only really have one foot in the academy most of the time. But I think it was an important place where Manning did a great deal of his work, and he did it with principle and integrity and seriousness, grappling with all the vast complications and contradictions that come with doing that work. So that's what I want to talk about today. I feel also really a presence of Manning Marable's example and his secular spirit in this room. I see many of my old Black Radical Congress comrades here. and it's very nice to see them. But I think this gathering also represents the many different terrains of struggle that Manning's career and life represented. So what a perfect title for a panel. Is another world possible? I think this is probably a question I've asked myself many, many times over the years, involved in various struggles, most of which didn't win what I thought they should have or could have won, and feeling some sense of disappointment. But is another world possible really has an easy answer for those of us who are historians. I think all of us on this panel, Horace is the interloper, he's our adopted social scientist brother. But to ask historians a question about the future, about what kind of future is possible, I think it's appropriate because many of us have looked back and studied the ways in which other people have transformed the world in different times and places. So of course, a new world is possible. The real question, the difficult, thorny question is, what kind of world? What do we need to do to get there? And who's going to be on that journey with us? I'm happy to try to reflect on this a little bit in the context of work going on and challenges going on university campuses. I think it is important we go out into community, and Rhonda talked about this a little in her presentation early. We go out into community as if we only have one identity ourselves. We talk about going and being in solidarity with communities, those of us who see ourselves as scholar activists. But there is a lot of work to do on college campuses among those of us who have the luxury and the privilege to write and teach and research for a living. And so the question is, what kind of work can we do in service and in solidarity and as a part of, not in the leadership of, but as a part of and in service to social movements, radical movements, movements for social transformation. I think there are a number of things we grapple with in our unique location. The contradiction between campus and community, between insiders and outsiders, between scholarship and activism. This mapping for me, though, as I think about it over the years, is really not only a dialectical relationship between these seemingly opposite binaries, but it's also a symbiotic relationship on another level. Most of us wouldn't occupy the space that we now occupy or be able to write the books that we write and do the work that we do if community people, people that are, often still harassed and profiled when they come on our campuses, did not open this space up for us. It happened here at Columbia. It happened all over the country. And Martha Biondi, I think, is in the audience, has written a book about Black Power on campus and talking about the community and campus ties. But the Academy didn't open its doors to people like us because it finally saw the light. The doors were opened, and I think that means that we have a special obligation, those of us who work inside. I think this is something that Manning Marable understood very, very profoundly. I understand that over the years, at Columbia, you referred to the early strikes, but really every decade on this campus there has been a struggle around the colonial relationship that this institution has had with the Harlem community. There's been pushback and there have been challenges not only for how this university defines itself vis-a-vis a larger community, but how it defines itself. That is, what gets taught here, who gets let in, the kind of work that goes on. There have been indeed pitched battles around that very question. So I think how we form alliances and how we push and hold accountable the institutions where we work is an important question. But an equally important question is how we situate and see ourselves in these contexts. Ella Baker would often ask the question to people who would come to interview her or talk to her, meet with her. She would ask the question, who are your people? And she didn't mean that in the sense of, tell me where your people went to school or what they own or what their name is. She meant, where do you situate yourself? Where are your loyalties? Who do you answer to in the final analysis? And I think that's really an important question for academics. For those of us who have been processed and credentialed and vetted, and especially if we've been tenured, we have to watch ourselves. We have to think of the inescapable reality that we are always from and of many places. I think of Kathy Cohen, for example, who is a distinguished researcher, a good friend, teacher, a well-known social scientist, but she's also the daughter of a postal worker from Toledo and the aunt of a nephew who himself has been sucked into the criminal justice system, as many of our sons and nephews have been. I think of Robin Kelley, with all of his accomplishments and publications and adoring students, is a former McDonald's counter clerk, the son of a mother poor in wealth and rich in wisdom. And I am who I am professionally, but I am also the daughter of Mississippi sharecroppers and Detroit factory workers. Vijay, the descendant somewhere along the way, I'm sure, of South Asian peasants. Horace, the son of former colonial subjects. Why do I offer these genealogies? Not because history defines us, and certainly not to suggest that DNA produces our politics. But if we have an honesty about memory and obligation, if we think of where we come from and who our people are, we begin to see a very different audience and a very different public for the work that we do inside the academy. Those of us who, those people who hold up and read a neoliberal view of history and memory would argue that individual success is enough. They would argue that to have the politics of representation, a sort of anemic politics of brown faces and black faces in high places, is a marker of success. But I think it's really important in understanding the neoliberal restructuring of education to look at the ways in which the demands of past decades around anti-racism and anti-colonialism, and this is echoing some of what Horace was getting at on a global scale, but to see how those demands have been distorted, hijacked, redeployed into something almost unrecognizable. That is, and Vijay Prashad has written about this, you know, the politics of multiculturalism and diversity takes anti-racism and eviscerates the robust politics that fought against white supremacy and colonialism and turns it into a very different kind of enterprise. So there's a real challenge, I think, for those of us who work inside the academy to refuse to be collaborators in this process, to refuse to collaborate in the ranking and scoring and exclusion of certain of our children, to refuse to collaborate in the barring of undocumented children from our campuses. And the real question then is, how do we resist? How do we resist the corporatization of universities? How do we resist the increasingly market-driven policies and practices on our campuses? How do we resist this sort of distorting and depoliticization and dehistoricization of some of the progressive victories of the past? They're not easy answers to these, but one of them is to really get beyond a kind of notion of individual success as any barometer of progress for the struggles that we have waged and been a part of. The idea that we can have black bodies divorced from black communities, the fact that we can have brown bodies divorced from the legacy and history of colonialism really does a disservice to and is a corrupting and corrosive way of viewing the kind of struggles that so many of us have been a part of and supported for so many years. The other thing I think we really have the task of doing is speaking out against repression and censorship, both on and off of our campuses, and we see many recent examples of this. One of the issues that is difficult, if not impossible to talk about, of course, is the issue of Palestine. The Zionist Organization of America recently at Rutgers University has filed a complaint with the Department of Education Civil Rights Division charging professors who speak out and criticize the state of Israel, which of course many progressive Jews do in this country, charging them with anti-Semitism and really trying to harass and silence that conversation. Last week, the right-wing zealot David Horowitz took out an ad in the New York Times in which he singled out either 6 or 8 professors, and believe me, there'll be more, charging people who criticize the illegal occupation of Palestine with anti-Semitism and equating them with Nazis. And those 6 people might have felt targeted by that very, very expensive ad. But believe me, he was saying something, and the New York Times, by agreeing to place that ad, was saying something to the rest of us as well, attempting to intimidate and to impose and uphold this wall of silence around the issue of Israel and Palestine, and those of us who seek to speak out in solidarity with the Palestinian people. On another note, but I think not totally unrelated, a teacher in Pontiac, Michigan lost her job for actually encouraging her students to express sympathy to the Trayvon Martin family. So this attempt to intimidate, this kind of, going back to the McCarthy era and attempting to intimidate progressive, and not even radical in many cases, but just progressive people who are trying to insert politics and insert a set of values and principles into their work on campuses is really dangerous. So, Toni Morrison asked the question in one of her writings, who are your intellectual neighbors? I think that's another question we have to think of in thinking of what are the barriers and boundaries and gates around our campuses and around the discourse and debates that we often have. We have to speak in a language that people understand, and we have to understand that there are reservoirs of knowledge beyond our campuses. Reservoirs of knowledge such as the Black Youth Project that Kathy Cohen heads up, Project South, the Immigrant Youth Justice League, an organization that I support in Chicago, the anti-eviction campaigns in the townships in South Africa, and the list goes on. We have an obligation to resist the privatization of public education. I teach at a large public institution in Illinois, which now only 10% of its budget actually comes from the state. So essentially, that budget is carried on the backs of working class parents and students and corporations and foundations that decide what they want to support. What has to also factor into our calculus is not only our students that sit before us in the classroom, but the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of students who are abandoned by the public school system, who sit in prisons and jails throughout this country. We have to see these as our students, our prospective students, and certainly as our prospective teachers. The other issue on college campuses that I think sometimes gets short shrift, and we would all say we support it, but we sometimes forget to put it on the agenda, is that the majority of Black and brown people on our campuses, and certainly the majority of low income and working class and poor folks on our campuses, are not people who are writing books or dissertations. They're people who are cleaning toilets and working in cafeterias and cleaning up dorm rooms. So campus workers have to be a part of any kind of strategy for organizing within the academy. We also have to refuse to have our vision of a different kind of world and our vision of the work that we do where we're located as being narrowed and domesticated. Horace started us off with a big global radical Pan-Africanist vision. I think a radical transnational and post-colonial feminist vision can go hand in hand with that. And talking about our sisters and brothers in places like Berzeit University in the occupied West Bank, people in Zimbabwe who are doing work at University of Zimbabwe, and other places around the globe, that this has to be a part of our community of scholars and collaborators when we're thinking and envisioning what kind of world we want to build. So how do we help to midwife a new world, to unleash our radical imagination, to realize what Robin calls our freedom dreams? Well, it seems to me sometimes we think large and live small, and this was not true of Manning Marable. I think many of us who have come here today have been convened and cajoled and pushed by Manning to come to many kinds of gatherings like this. To come and to talk and to strategize and to argue with each other, which I've done with many people in this room for many, many years, and I love you all still. But these kind of convenings, these kind of convenings are important, and it's important for us to live large in the sense that we reach beyond some of our comfort zones and that we push ourselves to make connections with one another, not only about our scholarship, but also about our activism, that we make room for voices that aren't credentialed and voices that aren't credentialed in the movements as well. And in that, on that note, I know I only have a minute, but in Chicago right now, there's a really important struggle, and it's a struggle that the mayor of Chicago is trying to shut down a number of mental health centers, and one of them is down the street from Kathy, the Woodlawn Clinic. And some of our students and some of us have been supporters and have been involved in those struggles, but really in a supportive capacity, because it's the patients that have gone to those clinics for mental health services that have been some of the most articulate spokespersons for defending the need for those clinics in those communities. And I think sometimes those of us who talk for a living, we forget that we have to make room for people who don't talk for a living and people who might need a little more time to find their voice in the struggle. So the power of listening and the power of making room for all of these voices and really figuring out what we can learn from them is key. We also have to speak out about difficult issues, issues of homophobia and misogyny, that we don't defer to reactionary ministers and other so-called leaders in our communities because they claim to have mass support. I mean, some of them do have more support than I would like to concede, but that's another struggle I think that has to be waged, and that's very rampant in certain communities. And I want to also echo Horace's mentioning of Haiti. One of the, here we are 2.5 years after the natural disaster in Haiti, which was followed by something that didn't have to be a disaster, which is the abandonment of many of the Haitian people. And there's a number of organizations that are taking the lead from Haitian people and taking the lead from farmers in Haiti as well. A group called RISA, Rising in Solidarity with Haiti, has been in the forefront of that. And I think that it's not the issues that are in the news or the issues that we've just written books about, but the issues that are simmering and brewing that we have to continually hold up. Finally, I just want to say, in terms of thinking of, again, Manning Marable's example of doing the difficult work replete with contradictions inside the academy. We look around this room, it's replete with contradictions. If you read some of the names of the benefactors on the wall, it says quite a lot. But I think there was a tension in Manning's work as an outsider within. As an outsider that was not simply Du Bois's divided soul, but an outsider within who deferred to the outside. That is, an outsider within doesn't mean you're inside the doors, and when you go outside the doors, you can speak in a different parlance and you might dress a little bit differently and you're down with the folks. It means that when you're inside, you actually defer to the people who are excluded. So it's not about being bicultural. It's about getting your foot in the door and opening as wide as you can, but also making changes once you're in the room. The other thing is about privileging insurgent knowledges. That is, not assuming that the discourse as it's framed is what we have to respond to, and being willing to be peripheral to the people who might very well blurb your book, vote on your promotion, et cetera, but that part of the obligation of remembering who our people are is playing a different role in those contexts and understanding the power of insurgent knowledges, both in the street, in movements for social transformation, and potentially in the classroom and in our scholarship as well. So in thinking of this question, is another world possible? I think of the remarks of an often quoted remark by Arundhati Roy, which is, of course, demanding that we listen. She said, another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, and I would say if we can sometimes be quiet long enough and listen to one another, we can hear her breathing.
Nice.
Thank you.
Fortunately, the only description of a person that I managed to erase is somebody I know well. Robin Kelley has written several books which have changed the way you have to think about labor history, cultural history, and African American history. He's an amazing thinker as well as an amazing scholar, and his latest biography of Thelonious Monk is a great example of that. Robin Kelley.
Thank you, Mark. So can you hear me? It's working? Okay, good. Well, first of all, I have to thank the organizers for putting on this extraordinary conference. Folks I've known for some while. I have to especially thank Leith Mullings, both because of not just her presence and role in all this, but she was teaching me before she met Manning. I mean, we go way back, and as a scholar, as an intellectual, as an activist, I think her presence here is very vital. And then finally, finally, the members of this panel, I was thinking to myself as I sat here, if I've known everyone on this panel for at least 15 to 20 years, so combined it's like almost like 80 years maybe together. And so in all extraordinary activists, extraordinary thinkers I learn from all the time. I chose the topic of Palestine. The title of my talk, which has a formal title, which is Letter from a West Bank Refugee Camp. And let me tell you a little bit about this. First of all, it's in honor of Manning, who, as an activist, had been out front on the question of Palestinian self-determination since the 1980s. And while it's true that in the 80s there seemed to be a lot more black leadership and solidarity with like the PLO in those days, that support had been diminishing regularly after Oslo. But Manning represents a core of black radicals who have never wavered on the question of Palestine. And I can't name them all, but the ones that come to mind, of course, Jack Odell, who was the first to lead a black delegation to Palestine, as far as I know, Barbara Ransby, Bill Fletcher, Angela Davis, Horace Campbell, Gina Dent, Cornel West, Leith Mullings, Ron Daniels, Kathy Cohen, Alice Walker, Reverend Graylin Hagler, among others. And so I just want to acknowledge that, because this letter I'm about to read to you is a call to black leadership, in some ways for its general failure. Manning also recognized the importance of the creation of Israel in the Nakba, in the question of Palestine, in the evolution of Malcolm's thinking. And in Palestine, I would argue that a new world's not just possible, but necessary for the basic survival of people. And this is where the anti-apartheid movement is right this minute. So my letter pays homage in some very direct, obvious ways to Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And it's obvious in its tone and language. And it is a reply to the so-called Vanguard Leadership Group, which is essentially AIPAC's Black Voice. They had put out a full-page letter attacking Students for Justice in Palestine, specifically in response to a conference here at Columbia last October. Okay, so let me just read this letter. Dear members of the Vanguard Leadership Group and African-American leaders everywhere, while visiting the Ida refugee camp in the occupied West Bank, I came across your recent statements defending Israel against charges that it is an apartheid state. You accuse Students for Justice in Palestine for spreading, quote, misinformation and invoking an illegitimate analogy that anyone familiar with the, quote, truth about the Israelis' record on human rights would find patently false. The evidence? Unlike black South Africans, the, quote, Arab minority in Israel enjoys full citizenship and with voting rights and representation in the government. As I reflect on your words, and this is what I was drafting this while I was in Palestine, actually, in January. As I reflect on your words, I take in the landscape from the rooftop of a deteriorating housing complex inside the refugee camp. On this extraordinarily clear, crisp day, the illegal apartheid wall dominates the terrain, abutting the camp and snaking in both directions as far as the eye can see. Rising above the 20-foot wall is the notorious Bethlehem checkpoint, where Palestinians entering Jerusalem are subject to frequent interrogation, harassment, and delay. Beyond the wall, atop a low sloping rise, sits the illegal Jewish settlement of Gilo. In the valley adjacent to the camp are the remains of what was a Palestinian village, a couple of small dwellings occupied by families who refused to be driven off by settler violence. We learned that the children attend the camp's UN-run school, but the wall has turned a 10-minute walk into a 2-hour ordeal each way. Your statement reveals a woeful ignorance of Israel's history and a basic understanding of apartheid. First, apartheid did more than strip black South Africans of voting rights and civil rights. The regime dispossessed Africans from their land and through legislative and military acts, raised entire communities and transferred Africans to government townships and Bantustans. It was a system of racial classification and population control that limited the movements of Africans in towns and cities and denied them social and economic privileges based on race. And it outlawed every organization that challenged the right of an apartheid state to exist, i.e., a state based on racial or ethnic hierarchy, and used state violence and detention to suppress opposition. Israel has been practicing a form of apartheid since its inception. After destroying some 380 Palestinian villages and ethnically cleansing Palestinian towns and neighborhoods in mixed cities in 1948, confiscating land without compensation, what Palestinians called the Nakba, or al-Nakba, the catastrophe, Israel passed the absentee property law of 1950, effectively transferring all property owned or used by Palestinian refugees to the state, and then denied their right to return or reclaim their losses. The land grab continued after the 1967 war and military occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, which comprised merely 22% of all of Western Palestine to begin with. In violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, Jewish settlements in the occupied territories have expanded exponentially since 1967. Currently, there are over 500,000 settlers living in the West Bank, and at least 43% of the land has been allocated to settler, regional, and local councils, and therefore is off limits for Palestinian use. And so are certain roads. Israel has built an elaborate system of paved, settler-only roads that cross over crumbling, often blockaded Palestinian roads. Special licenses are required to travel on the settler roads. Unauthorized vehicles could be confiscated and their drivers detained. Your statement ignores the 4 million Palestinians living under Israeli occupation and the millions living abroad or in refugee camps in neighboring countries. Instead, you refer only to the alleged citizenship rights of the 1.5 million, quote, Arab Israelis, roughly 20% of the population living within Israel. Yes, they have voting rights, and yes, a small minority has been elected to office, but Israeli law is very clear. The only citizens who enjoy full rights and nationality are Jews. Under the law of return, Jews from anywhere in the world can obtain automatic citizenship and residency in Israel, whereas the citizenship law abolishes the rights of the Palestinian citizens' relatives to return to their homes and land. The, quote, non-Jew, namely Palestinian citizens of Israel, are legally denied equal access to property, social and welfare services, and material resources administered by the state, including 93% of the territory of the pre-1967 borders administered by the Israeli Land Administration. And then there are Palestinian citizens who live in Israel but are bizarrely classified by the absentee property law as, quote, absent, because they allegedly abandoned their property. They were not just driven from it. They have no rights to land, houses, bank accounts, bank safes, and other property that had been owned prior to 1948. For Palestinian citizens in Israel, however, discrimination defines their daily reality. Most are obliged to live in exclusively Arab villages that have been prohibited from expanding, are legally excluded from residing in non-Arab communities based on their, quote, social unsuitability, attend several severely underfunded schools, are denied government employment, and are prohibited from living with their spouse if she or he is a Palestinian from the occupied territories. Okay? Little wonder that more than half of all Palestinian families in Israel were classified as poor in 2009. And every Palestinian citizen of Israel traveling through Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion Airport endures systematic racial profiling, are subject to interrogations, manual bag checks, issue different passport stickers and luggage tags to signal their Arab ethnicity and a higher threat level. Palestinian Israelis can expect their check-in process to take about twice as long as their fellow Jewish citizens. What about their precious political rights? Palestinian citizens of Israel, including minors, are routinely arrested for participating in protests critical of the state. Political organizations advocating boycott of Israeli products or calling for a secular state with equal rights for all are essentially illegal. The Knesset even passed a law forbidding the commemoration of the Nakba, or even mentioning it in school textbooks. You praise Israeli democracy and its record on human rights, and yet several Palestinian members of the Knesset have been indicted or had parliamentary privileges revoked for legitimate political activities and speech. Just taking these laws and practices alone meet the UN's definition of apartheid, i.e., any measures designed to, quote, prevent a racial group or groups from participation in the political, social, economic, and cultural life of the country, including the right to leave and to return to their country, the right to a nationality, the right to freedom of movement and residence, the right to freedom of opinion and expression. Even if you find the UN definition of apartheid illegitimate, how do you respond to Shulamit Aloni, former Minister of Education under Yitzhak Rabin, who declared, quote, the state of Israel practices its own quite violent form of apartheid with the native Palestinian population? Or let's say Michael Ben Yair, Israel's Attorney General from 1993 to 1996, who observed, and I quote, in effect, we established an apartheid regime in the occupied territories immediately following their capture. Now, while your statement deplores the apartheid analogy, it fails to express any concern for the conditions of Palestinians. You say you want justice and the hope of peace and reconciliation, but until you've seen Palestinian homes demolished and their olive trees uprooted by the IDF, walked through the souk in Hebron littered with bricks and garbage and human feces thrown at Palestinian merchants by Messianic settlers, negotiated the narrow, muddy pathways separating overcrowded multi-storied shacks in the refugee camps in Nablus or Jenin or Bethlehem, met mothers who had given birth on the side of the road or watched their severely ill children die for want of emergency care because they were held up at an Israeli checkpoint, or spoke with parents whose boys have been detained, maimed, or even killed for throwing rocks at tanks, or have to explain to a child why her family has to ration water while the Jewish settlement a couple miles away maintains swimming pools, you will never comprehend what is required for a just peace and genuine reconciliation. But is a just peace in the Middle East your real objective? Your founders, Darius Jones and Jared Jordan, both graduates of Clark Atlanta University, claim that the mission of VLG, or the Vanguard Leadership Group, was to nurture a new generation of African American leaders, quote, possessed of a more expansive and inclusive worldview. And yet, you foreclosed an inclusive worldview for the tunnel vision of your primary financial backer, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC. And for at least the past 4 years, VLG members have participated in AIPAC-sponsored tours of Israel and developed its talking points through its Saban leadership training seminars. AIPAC not only honored Jones and Jordan with its Jonathan Barkin Israel Advocacy Award in 2009 and named the VLG its AIPAC Advocate of the Year for its attack on SJP, but rewarded Jones with a lucrative gig as its Southeast Regional Outreach Director. So he works for AIPAC. He gets paid by AIPAC. So let's be clear.
Surprise, surprise.
You do not speak for African Americans, nor does AIPAC speak for most American Jews. And you certainly do not embrace the principles of social justice and liberation. Despite your identification with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you speak for the state of Israel, which is not the same as speaking for Israelis, many of whom want an end to the occupation and the apartheid system in their country. And the fact that you do speak for AIPAC reveals a lobby so desperate for black allies that it is willing to overlook your own leaders' problematic comments. Mr. Jordan, for example, compared the SJP's decision to hold its 2011 national conference at Columbia University to, and I quote, the Ku Klux Klan holding a conference at Morehouse College in Atlanta, a total affront to Jewish culture and identity. In other words, whereas Morehouse is an historically black college, Columbia University, ergo, is an historically Jewish institution in a historically Jewish city. Reeking of Jesse Jackson's Hymietown slur, it not only ignores Columbia's own history of anti-Semitism, but paints, quote, Jewish culture and identity as a monolith. It also equates a student solidarity movement with the Klan, an organization whose anti-Semitism rivaled its own anti-black racism, I mean the Klan. And then there's the curious case of Darius Jones, who just 2 years before his involvement with AIPAC, wrote a blog called 9 Ether News that reads like a cross between Oswald Spengler, Herbert Spencer, and Mein Kampf. He writes, "Our race," this is October 4th in 2006, "Our race would be wise to learn from nature. We would be even better served to harmonize with its evolutionary designs. Clearly, survival of the fittest is the moral of the story. However, we continually ignore what is patently obvious. Social dynamics move more in accordance with biological prerogatives than humanistic ideals." Okay? Perhaps Mr. Jones also sees Israel-Palestine in social Darwinian terms. Israel prevailed because Palestinians could not compete. Expansion of the fittest. Okay? None of this is surprising. AIPAC, through the American Israel Education Foundation, and Christians United for Israel, CUFI, founded by the controversial Reverend John Hagee, have been working overtime to recruit black students, elected officials, and religious leaders to serve as moral shields for Israel's policies of subjugation, settlement, segregation, and dispossession. CUFI's coordinator of African American outreach, Michael Stevens, invokes the ghost of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to the cause, declaring in a recent interview, quote, "King was a strong African American Zionist." Now, King certainly dissuaded black militants from critiquing Zionism, there's no question about that, and he avoided taking a public stand on the '67 war, but had he lived long enough, I would argue, to see the crippling effects of the occupation, his unequivocal opposition to violence, colonialism, racism, and militarism would make him an incisive critic of Israel's current policies. He would probably join Bishop Desmond Tutu in support of the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign. Indeed, I can envision Dr. King in Palestine waging a nonviolent campaign to bring down the wall, perhaps writing another memorable letter to those who remain silent in the face of such egregious violations of human rights. This time around, he would probably address his letter to black leaders rather than white clergy. Ironically, while you, CUFI, and like-minded black organizations claim Dr. King's legacy, I'm witnessing King's vision in practice, his vision of nonviolent resistance, creative tension, love, right here in the Ida refugee camp. Ida is a home to the IRAAS Cultural and Theater Society, a genuine community center and youth theater founded by director, poet, playwright, and educator Dr. Abdel Fattah Al-Bussour. For him, theater is, quote, a nonviolent way of saying we are humans. We are not born with genes of hatred and violence. We do not conform to the stereotypes of Palestinians only capable of throwing stones or burning tires. Having grown up in the camp, Al-Bussour gave up a promising career in science to devote his life to creating a beautiful theater of resistance, as he calls it, aimed at releasing the creative capacity of young people to turn their stories into transformative experiences. In Al-Bussour's play, We Are the Children of the Camp, children speak from personal experience about Israeli soldiers invading the camps, shooting parents, and denying them access to hospitals on the other side of the wall. They long for human rights, a clean environment, freedom, a right to return to their land, and the right to know and own their history. They encapsulate this history in the play's title song, in which they sing of being made refugees in their own land, colonies built, and villages demolished. The children at the Ida camp remind me that what is most apt about the South African analogy is not the litany of laws and abuses, but the struggle, the optimism of the will, as Said used to say, the prefiguring of a post-apartheid society. As one song from Children of the Camp puts it, quote, occupation never lasts. The government of injustice vanishes with revolution. Let us all hope that as more and more young Palestinians create democratic alternatives to settler colonialism and its racist, anti-democratic ideology, and more Israelis come to see how occupation and apartheid distort their own lives and dreams, and that more and more people around the globe join the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement and refuse to invest in Israel's regime of occupation and apartheid, injustice will give way to something beautiful. Yours for the cause of peace and justice, Robin Gigi Kelley. Thank you.
Wow.
That is bold. Wow. In Columbia.
Our final speaker is Vijay Prashad, author of 11 books, most recently The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, which was chosen as the best nonfiction book of 2008 by the Asian American Writers Workshop. Vijay, Prashad.
Can I speak from here?
Oh, of course.
Thanks. I can't sit down and speak. Leith, Joanna, Robin, thank you for involving me in this. I very much appreciate being here. I feel like my bookshelf has come alive. Of course, Angela, Bill Fletcher, Barbara, Mark, Horace, yes, and Robin Kelley, who I've known for 25 years, starting sweating against apartheid in South Africa and now against apartheid in Israel. So it's great to be here. In August 1964, Malcolm X spent several weeks in Egypt. While in Cairo, he wrote an essay in the Egypt Gazette entitled "Racism, the Cancer That is Destroying America." Here, Malcolm X noted, "The common goal of 22 million Afro-Americans is respect and human rights. We can never get civil rights in America until our human rights are first restored." The distinction is essential. Civil rights are earned through the state form. They are historically specific to the modern world and come through the agenda of the modern state, only because the struggles of ordinary people to move the ideals of the early modern era into the realm of legality. These are civil rights. Human rights, Malcolm notes, are to be restored. They are innate, the essence of our species being, the way we, as social actors, want to see ourselves, and how our best instincts force us to see each other. These are innate, but they are not always enacted. For human history is as much a struggle of ordinary people for justice, that is civil rights, as it is the march of dehumanization. The dance between human rights, our rights as people in society, and civil rights, our rights as citizens in states, is a fundamental part of the grammar of modern politics. To believe that to win civil rights from the states is sufficient, to believe that that is sufficient, is what constitutes modern liberalism. Legal provisions for equality are enough for it. That is why it celebrates the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as its highest achievement. After that, modern liberalism sees that the task is to tinker with reality, not to fundamentally transform it. Malcolm X looked through and beyond modern liberalism. Of course, civil rights in the state are necessary, but these are not sufficient. More is required. The great tragedy of the movement that fought for civil rights within the United States is that it won its liberal victory just when the United States economy and society were violently transformed. The structural process of globalization and the Reaganist anti-state policy combined to undermine the very institutions that had been tasked with upholding the civil rights of the newly enfranchised minorities. A weakened state and a national economy convulsed by the domination of finance and by wage arbitrage would not be able to guarantee the civil rights of the people. This is what Malcolm saw, and this is why he was quick to seize on the distinction between civil rights and human rights. It is also fitting that Malcolm made these comments in Egypt. It is a long-standing tradition in African-American radical thought that over the course of a career, its political intellectuals have begun with hope that justice would be attained within the American project, and then in the course of struggle, come to the realization that absent an internationalist perspective, this dream is futile. The importance of Pan-Africanism is here, but Pan-Africanism is a concrete form of what is the more general affirmation, the importance of an internationalist politics. Since 1964, the liberal doctrine of multiculturalism has enabled the state to absorb a small percentage of minorities into the ranks of the elite, while at the same time, the question of human rights for the majority of minorities languishes. Barack Obama and Susan Rice put a sophisticated face on contemporary imperialism at the same time as the state enhances a regime to devastate the social world of the darker nations. That mix of globalization and Reaganism, which tragically undermined the goals of the civil rights victories, is what constitutes neoliberalism, opening up for profit areas of social life that had been communal, selling public assets at throwaway prices to private speculators, allowing finance to become dominant over social life, and enabling real estate and insurance to produce massive bubbles that burst in slow motion and then spectacularly in 2008. The social consequences of neoliberalism have been grotesque. Global unemployment is at spectacularly high levels. The International Labour Organization estimates that the current vulnerable unemployment rate is over 50%. The ILO's 2012 report has a stark fact, or series of facts. In 2011, 74.8 million youth aged 15 to 24 were unemployed, an increase of more than 4 million since 2007. The global youth unemployment rate is at 12.7%, remains a full percentage point higher than the pre-crisis level. Globally, young people are nearly 3 times as likely as adults to be unemployed. In addition, an estimated 6.4 million young people have given up hope of finding a job and have dropped out of the labor market altogether. You can vote, but you can't work. High unemployment comes in a context of a collapsed state support network, a weakened social fabric, and criminally high food and fuel prices that have resulted mostly from commodity speculation in these markets. From Rome, the Food and Agriculture Organization reports that the world's hungry have topped 1 billion this year. Former FAO director, and he's former because he said what I'm just going to read out to you, former FAO Director General Jacques Diouf has spent his entire career on food issues. Whether working on groundnut or rice or agriculture or hunger, Diouf has been a thoughtful champion of the problem of food and starvation. While releasing this most recent report, Diouf could not contain himself, and this is what he said. He said, "A dangerous mix of the global economic slowdown combined with stubbornly high food prices in many countries has pushed some 100 million more people than last year into chronic hunger and poverty. The silent hunger crisis, affecting 1/6 of all humanity, poses a serious risk for world peace and security." From 2008 onward, food riots have struck in Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Egypt, Haiti, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Korea, Mongolia. I could spend my whole time reading the list of countries. The IMF recognized that one of the spurs for the Arab revolt, the African revolt of this year, this past year, was the rising bread prices as a result of the end of the democracy of bread. You can vote, but you can't eat. It is bad enough if one is reduced to the level of bare life, but even worse if this condition is not general across the population. Rates of social inequality are at a record level for the modern era. In the United States, the Occupy movement raised the issue of the 1%. We know that they control obscene amounts of social wealth. It is scandalous, even more scandalous, when you look at the wealth situation at the global level. A recent UN report shows us that the richest 1%, I'm sorry for all the numbers, but you can't get through suffering without numbers. It's impossible to tell you this. I can't give you a picture without the numbers. So just do your best. Just feel the numbers. You don't have to remember them. A recent UN report shows us that the richest 1% of adults across the planet own 40% of global assets. And the richest 10% of all adults in the planet owned 85% of the world's total wealth. You can vote, but you have no power. Disparity and deprivation do not sit well with the commonplace ideas of fairness and justice. The powerful know this. The way they divide up the national budget of their countries demonstrates their values. The US national budget is given over to military and police expenditure, to prisons rather than schools, to guns rather than bread. Given the social consequences of neoliberalism, it is far more effective and logical to build a security apparatus, to cage people into devastated cities, or to hold them in congested, high-security prisons. There is nothing irrational about the prison industrial complex. From a neoliberal perspective, it is perfectly reasonable. Neoliberalism was always purchased with the iron fist rather than the velvet glove, whether your example is Chile, 1973, or New York City in Giuliani time. You could vote, but we've now locked you up. But you cannot lock up freedom. One of the great triumphs of the past 2 decades has been the gradual and by now almost total demise of the legitimacy of the current phase of capitalism. In other words, neoliberalism. The first big blow to neoliberalism came in South America, starting with the Caracazo in 1989 and ending in the pink tide of elections that brought in governments that leaned left. Over the past 2 years, we've seen massive protests in Africa and Asia, with the Arab Spring as the most dramatic, and then the Southern European uprisings bookended by the Occupy experiment. These tell us that neoliberalism is the naked emperor. The governing ideology of the ruling class is bankrupt. Neoliberalism has begun to be seen as delegitimate, but neither it nor the logic that governs beneath it, that is capitalism. Neoliberalism has begun to be seen as delegitimate, but neither it nor the logic that governs beneath it, that is capitalism, has been displaced for at least 2 reasons. First, neoliberalism continues to exercise institutional power through the central banks and the multilateral financial institutions. Inflation is their target, not jobs. There is no fiscal space, no policy space for states or politicians to exert other dreams, other imaginations. If they do not hold their debt down and keep inflation low, they are sanctioned by a rise in the price of their borrowing. Freedom to act is constrained by the dollarcrats who hold the keys to the vaults. Second, one of the long-term trends of the capitalist system is the move by those who control capital to substitute machines for labor. Capitalism is a massive labor-displacing system. The problem with actual workers is that they are restive, they get angry and demanding, and they are expensive. Machines are undemanding and cheaper. Machines might end up being ecologically devastating, but that's not relevant to capitalism. Machines might also end up being socially wonderful, since they free up time for leisure. But that would only work if the fruits of mechanization were not seized by the select few who control or own the social wealth. What we know for sure is that the time of the neoliberal security state, of the governments of the possible, is now over. Even if such states remain, the legitimacy of these states has eroded. The time of the impossible has presented itself. We need to fight for reforms because they are imperative for the survival of people. But the reforms themselves can never deliver more than survival. The system is simply not able to open its arms and embrace us. Profit and property are antithetical to love. There is nothing that we can tinker with to make this system any better. Many have already come around to the idea that they have become disposable to this system, and so they have disposed it. They have turned into the creation of alternative economies, even off-the-books economies. They have turned to new collectivities, to experimental forms of putting our social relations ahead of money. Our fear, or even my fear, my fear of the future, holds us back from fully embracing the time of the impossible. If we want to restore human rights, as Malcolm said, the time is now. Aadami tha, badi mushkil se insaan hua. We were people with great difficulty. We became human. Thank you.
Wow. Before we move to the question and answer, I would like the audience to acknowledge our keynote speaker, who will be on telecommunication conference with Mamiya Abdul Jamal tomorrow night at St. John the Divine at 7:30, Angela Davis. Okay, what we are going to do is have 3 questions in succession and then have the speakers respond. And I'll ask the questions to each be under a minute.
Hi, good evening. I rushed to get this question in. I appreciate Horace jumping in with starting out with the Tunisian Revolution and what that means to the new world that we want to create. I do have an issue with the categorization of Arab Spring, and I have an issue with the categorization of African revolutions, because I think the language of the people, which is Thawra a-Karama, dignity revolutions, is something that I would like the panelists to explore. What does it mean if we look at the new world fixated on the concept of dignity? And is that going to help us out in trying to understand what our direction is going? And the second thing is, if we're talking about human rights, does that language sometimes play into neoliberal individualism? And how do we prevent playing into neoliberal individualism when we try to advocate for human rights and dignity? Thank you.
Question 2.
Hi, thank you for such a great panel. We've spoken much today about freedom and new world, but I'm left really concerned and disturbed about one of the most oppressive state laws that have been passed recently, the ethnic studies law ban in Arizona, banning Mexican-American studies programs on the premise that teaching white oppression is teaching how to hate whites. So can you please respond? What are the implications of such a state law for race studies, African-American studies, Latino studies, and the new vision we have before us?
Okay. Third question, and then we'll move to answers. Yeah.
Thank you for the panel. I have a question that anybody can answer or respond to. I'm in my own head just trying to figure out what is a black position around the Arab Spring or the Israeli-Palestinian fight, given the situation of black people in Palestine who are organized around anti-black racism vis-a-vis the Palestinians, right? And the same in Egypt. And so how do we, so what's a position that actually also discusses the situation of black people in those places? Because I'm not hearing that, not just in this panel, but in any of the discussions about how we are supposed to be aligned around the people of Palestine without obviously supporting Israel. I mean, that's an obvious, so I just want to say that.
Okay, panelists respond, 3 questions, and then we'll move to the next. Okay.
I mean, I can start with the last question and try to be quick. I mean, one of the things about the issue of Palestinian solidarity, and this comes up a lot in the work in Chicago and in the BDS campaign, is don't we have enough problems here? And for me, well, there's two parts to your question. One is you're asking about the relatively small black Palestinian population in Palestine, right? Is that one question you're asking about? We didn't actually I went on a delegation with Angela in June, and unfortunately we didn't have an opportunity to meet with the representatives of that community in Jerusalem, but we did talk to two black Palestinians who were there, and they were very much a part of the struggle to end the occupation. I mean, it was the occupation that was compromising their humanity and ability to survive more than anything else. So, but the part of the question I kind of wanted to get at is, why is that an issue for black people in this country? And for me, it really resonated not so much the contrast between occupied Palestine and the United States, but the similarities. And one of the things that our delegation heard time and time again is this is the largest open prison in the world. And I think of the way young Palestinians are treated by Israeli occupying forces, and then I drive through the west side of Chicago and see, you know, young black men literally laying in the street while the police search the car. And, you know, there was just a real resonance of occupation there and occupation of some communities here. And so that to me is an important link that we often miss making.
Okay. Actually, there's so many questions, but let me just address Kenya's question. A couple things. One is that in my critique, and also based on our experience from our delegation, which like Angela and Barbara and Gina, we met Israeli Arab Africans in East Jerusalem. And there's a difference between the conditions of Africans in East Jerusalem under occupation, Africans inside of Israel itself, and some Africans who are actually migrant labor, you know, cheap migrant labor. Now, there's two responses to that. One is that within the Palestinian Authority, a lot of Palestinians are not down with the Palestinian Authority, nor does it mean that all Palestinians sort of are the same. There's actually deep, deep divisions, and there's some Palestinian business figures who are actually pushing a neoliberal agenda inside the West Bank, some willing to make peace with the occupation, and there's opposition to that. And there's racism everywhere. But what I found was my experiences with both intellectuals, activists, with beers at universities. I mean, people are very much aware of racism and trying to stamp it out because for them, it's part of transforming society. There's also issues of sexism, all those issues are always there, but what's really critical is that inside the occupied territories, there is a dual struggle against Israeli occupation and against the Palestinian Authority for its role as the police force for Israel. And then finally, as far as anti-black racism in Israel goes, there's the migrant population, but there's the Sephardic Jews, there's the Arab Jews, there are the Ethiopian Jews, many of whom have been organizing themselves against racism. And so there's a lot going on, and this just touches the surface, but unless the occupation, number one, ends and full human and civil rights are made available, none of this other stuff, I mean, this other stuff will be a struggle, but it's like really critical part of that wider struggle. I know someone also addressed the question about ethnic studies, which I think is a really, really important question. But I don't want to.
Okay, I wanted to say something about the question of the slogans for dignity in Tunisia, because the underlining of the idea of dignity was to raise the revolutionary slogan in a way which could be most inclusive to ensure that you bring the largest numbers of people. And this idea of dignity was repeated not only in the streets of Tunisia, but in the streets of Tahrir Square. So what does dignity mean today? During the time of enslavement, dignity meant ending slavery. During the time of colonialism, dignity meant ending colonialism. During the time of Jim Crow, dignity meant ending discrimination. But what does dignity mean today for people? And clearly, human beings cannot find dignity under the present system of capitalism. And that is why the capitalist system is discredited throughout the world. They are not using that language, but clearly the state cannot deliver the basic requirements, and the anti-imperialism is taking a religious form. But even those religious leaders that are coming to power, they have to resolve the questions that the people are facing inside of Egypt. One other point about this Tunisia and the so-called Arab Spring. The designation of peoples in Africa according to racial categories is something that's been imported into Africa. The history of Africa is richer than that. Africa is not about biology and races. Africa is not about geography. It's about a history. It's about people. It's about human beings. It's the home for all humanities. And it is the imperialists who introduced this idea of sub-Sahara and North Africa. And I think we should not buy into that language, because we have to see how the Africans who live in the near Middle East, who also follow the religion of Islam, some of our brothers and sisters in the Middle East identify with the ideas of Europe to say that Africans are inferior. So the struggles of Africans is how to lift the dignity of all so we end the hierarchy of human beings.
Well, I'll speak to the ethnic studies question, because I think that I don't fear the banning of ethnic studies. I think the context in which I see it is like this. I think that time is on our side. And I think the white supremacist section knows that. They know that there's a demographic problem. It used to be in 2050, this was going to be a majority-minority country. Then the Census Department had to say 2042. Now they are saying 2034. You see, there's a demographic problem, and they are very scared. And they are defensively, revanchistically attacking immigrants. There's a ramping up of racism. This is science. This is what Gramsci called the morbid symptoms of the interregnum. They have lost. These are demonstration effects of their defeat. But now we have to be confident enough not to be defensive in talking about ethnic studies. We should not talk like we are victims. We should talk like winners, because they have already been defeated.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions, and we'll take them in order and then have the panel respond.
Dr. Ransby, I'm glad you brought up the mental health clinics in Chicago and the austerity facing the schools. Nathaniel LaCour, who was a leader of the teachers unions in New Orleans, was on Democracy Now! A few years ago talking about how in resisting the privatization of schools after Katrina, people in the union got painted as defenders of the status quo. And what I'm wondering about is, in resisting and trying to defeat neoliberal privatizations, how do we not end up just fighting solely a rearguard action of defending statist, modernist institutions, which we may have, been critiquing and battling however many years ago? How do you have a critical and transformative stance vis-a-vis the state while trying to save critical public institutions?
Okay. Yes, sir.
This question is for Professor Campbell. I was struck by some of the comments you made in your speech, particularly with this idea of a simplistic orientation in terms of Pan-Africanist thought, with you're either anti-imperialist or pro-imperialist or what have you. And then you brought up the case study of Zimbabwe, and you brought up the point that the land seizure program, in which land is transferred from whites to a majority black population, doesn't work because it reproduces a structure. And I guess my question is, what then do you do? Like, is there room to sort of acknowledge the successes of a program like that, and then also acknowledge what else has to be done? Because I feel like in other programs that are about sort of dismantling institutions, particularly like with affirmative action, I know those who are opponents of affirmative action will say things like, well, affirmative action is too narrow. It doesn't talk about redistribution of resources and what have you. And then you have those on the other side who are proponents who say, let's look at what affirmative action has done positively, and then also look at how we can address other things. So I'm just wondering, is there room in a critique of Zimbabwe to say, listen, dismantling the system of settler colonialism is a positive step. Now what else can we talk about?
Okay.
Quickly responding to the other very, it's a big question. It's sort of the reform versus revolution question. How do we, if there's an attack on public housing, if there's an attack on public education, oh, there you are, it's so fraught and problematic to begin with. Do we want to defend those flawed institutions? And I think partly Vijay's very eloquent remarks earlier captures part of the response, which is that I think we fight the attacks, and we are fighting somewhat in defensive mode. But in that space of a struggle, even if it's a defensive struggle, I think there is room for imagining alternatives and room for forging alternatives, and to marry those dual ambitions of fighting back against attacks, and even, you know, using the opportunity or the moment of coming together, the moment of urgency, to mobilize people to both push back but also to imagine and to strategize and to collaborate to think of other possibilities. And that's an incomplete answer, but I think that contradiction is in pretty much all of the work that we do, including fighting, including anti-war campaigns, right, or anti-occupation campaigns, because embedded in that is the question of what next and what comes after.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the question, because it's something that is very visceral and touches the Pan-African world and the Pan-African struggle. But it's a larger question than Zimbabwe. It's a fundamental question about what is the future of property relations in agriculture. If you read the book by Samir Amin called The Liberal Virus, and he discusses this over and over again. What is going to be the future of agriculture in the 21st century? Can we reproduce the property relations and the forms of agricultural production of North America and Western Europe? In other words, if you fly over the United States of America and you see this private individual ownership of land, can the planet Earth reproduce that form of land individual ownership for 7 billion people? His answer is no, that you'll have to carry out genocide for 3 billion people in the rest of the world to reproduce that form of property relations. So if you're talking about building a new society in Zimbabwe and creating a higher form of society, then it is not an advance to take land from rich white people and give it to rich black people and exploit the masses of the people. I understand that there are some sections of the Zimbabwean society that have benefited from this transfer. But generally, it has not been for the masses of the people. And more importantly, they have doing it in association with the very backward policies of looting in the rest of the economy. We can see what's going on in Marange, in the diamond areas. We've seen their relationship to other resources in the society. And we must add also the backwardness of the Zimbabwean government in how it exploits anti-racism and exploits homophobia inside of the African and Pan-African movement.
Okay. Very well. Robin? I just wanted to, actually I want to address Christian's question as well. I agree with everything that Barbara said. I want to add a couple other things. One, and since you're working on New Orleans, you know, there was a moment in which groups like Community Labor United and others took over the housing projects. That was a visionary moment where they could have they took them over, they started to clean them up, transform them into another form. But the state came in and said, you can't do that. Now, if anyone reads Friedrich Hayek, The Constitution of Liberty, or Road to Serfdom, which I read all that stuff because I teach a class in neoliberal. If you read Milton Friedman, Capitalism and Freedom, basically they had that right to take that property and transform it. The state's intervention goes against everything that the neoliberal ideologues in the post-war period goes, you know, so in other words, the neoliberal state goes against the theoretical foundations of neoliberalism, which would be, that's ingenuity. You take over the space. Right now, we're seeing a wave of amazing worker seizures of, not seizures, but workers taking over factories and other kinds of firms that have been abandoned. And they basically collectively sort of take over and create worker cooperatives. And this is sort of the new phase. The problem is that none of that stuff will be allowed under a state regime that claims to be about liberalism in the old 19th century, but they're not. It's not about that, because that's the opportunity. It's taking those institutions and saying, you know what, we abandon them, we'll allow the people to take them, and transforming into something else. This is exactly what Barbara's talking about. There's no shortage of vision and imagination of even taking over schools. But when they start to succeed and do something that counters the dominant ideology, it's going to be taken over. And watch, mark my word, all the farms in Detroit and all the excitement around urban gardening, that stuff is going to be seized when it becomes potentially profitable. Because neoliberalism is not really about 19th century liberalism. It's something new. And I want to just, I dare all of you to read Hayek and Friedman and Mises. Read that stuff, and you're going to see an interesting contradiction.
Okay, I'd like now to bring up Fred Harris, Director of the Institute of Research and African American Studies, to make an announcement. But before he comes up, I just want to thank our panelists for one of the most amazing, transformative sessions that I've ever seen. That's amazing. Just amazing.